The cold December air of 2015 had settled over Versailles, Kentucky, a town known for its rolling green pastures and thoroughbred horse farms. It was a place where the rhythms of life were steady and predictable, where the greatest dramas often played out on a racetrack, not in the quiet, tree-lined streets of its residential neighborhoods. In a two-story home on Douglas Avenue, the Tipton family slept, unaware that the peace of their ordinary lives was about to be irrevocably shattered. Dean and Heather Tipton had built a bustling, happy home, filled with the noise and love of their 4 children. The eldest, Dakota, was a watchful and protective big sister. Her younger siblings, including 6-year-old Logan, with his bright eyes and infectious smile, were the center of their world. On the night of December 6th, as the family settled into their beds, there was no premonition of the darkness that was traveling toward them, a darkness that had a name and a face, but no reason. Miles away in Indianapolis, Indiana, Ronald Exantis, a 32-year-old dialysis nurse, was also preparing for a journey. But his was not a journey of healing or care, the very tenets of his profession. It was a journey into a madness that would defy explanation, a descent into a private hell that he was about to unleash on a family of strangers. He got into his car and drove south, the miles of dark highway stretching before him, each one bringing him closer to a destination he had seemingly chosen at random, a house he had never seen, a family he did not know. The reasons for his journey would later be debated by lawyers and psychiatrists, dissected in courtrooms and news reports. But in that moment, as he crossed the state line into Kentucky, he was simply a specter of violence, a man untethered from reason, heading toward the unsuspecting Tipton home. In the pre-dawn hours of December 7th, 2015, the silence of the house on Douglas Avenue was broken. Ronald Exantis slipped inside, a shadow moving through the sleeping home. He walked to the kitchen, a room that was the heart of the Tipton family, a place of shared meals and morning chatter. There, he selected his weapon, a kitchen knife. With the cold steel in his hand, he ascended the stairs, moving with a chilling purpose toward the rooms where the children slept. The horror began in Logan Tipton's bedroom. The 6-year-old boy, asleep in the safety of his bed, was the first target of Exantis's inexplicable rage. The attack was brutal and swift, a flurry of violence that ended the life of a child before he could even comprehend the nightmare that had invaded his room. The screams that followed were a primal sound of terror, a sound that ripped through the quiet house and tore Dean and Heather from their sleep. Dean Tipton, reacting on pure instinct, rushed out of his bedroom and was met with a scene of unimaginable horror. At the top of the stairs, he confronted the intruder. When I reached the top of the stairs, he lunged at me with a knife, Dean would later recount. The struggle was desperate and violent. Dean was stabbed and thrown across the room with incredible force, landing some 10 to 15 feet away. The chaos and terror spread through the upstairs rooms. Dakota, Logan's older sister, was also attacked. He stabbed me in the back, and then stomped on my head, she recalled. Her memory of the event was a fragmented tapestry of pain and horror. I remember waking up across the room, not where I was at, and I looked and he was killing Logan and Logan was screaming. Exantis had also attacked 2 of Logan's other sisters, his rage spreading through the family like a contagion. In the midst of the mayhem, Exantis's words were as chilling as his actions. He told one of the daughters that he was going to kill every one of us. It was a declaration of intent, a verbal confirmation of the slaughter he was attempting to carry out. The house that had once been a sanctuary had become a slaughterhouse, the scene of a crime so senseless and random it defied all understanding. When the police arrived, they found a scene of carnage. Logan Tipton was dead, his small body bearing the devastating wounds of Exantis's attack. Dean and his daughters were injured, their bodies and minds scarred by the violence they had endured. Ronald Exantis, the man who had brought this hell upon them, was still in the house. He was taken into custody, his bloody rampage finally at an end. The investigation that followed only deepened the mystery. Why had a dialysis nurse from Indianapolis, with no criminal record and no connection to the Tipton family, driven to Versailles to commit such a heinous act? The question hung over the community, a cloud of disbelief and fear. The legal proceedings against Ronald DeSantis began, and the focus quickly shifted from what he had done, that was never in dispute, to why. His defense team, led by public defender Bridget Hoffler, built their case around a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. They argued that DeSantis was in the throes of a severe psychotic episode, that he was so detached from reality that he was not criminally responsible for his actions. They painted a picture of a man who believed he was on a divine mission, that voices were commanding him to perform a human sacrifice to save his own children. The trial, which took place in April 2018, was a painful and grueling affair for the Tipton family. They were forced to relive the worst night of their lives in the sterile, public setting of a courtroom. They listened as psychiatrists testified about DeSantis' mental state, as lawyers debated the nuances of sanity and culpability. For them, it was simple. A man had broken into their home and murdered their son. The prosecution argued that while DeSantis may have been mentally ill, he was not insane. They pointed to the deliberate nature of his actions, the drive from another state, the choice of a house, the act of arming himself with a knife from the kitchen. These were not the actions of a man completely divorced from reality, they contended, but of a man who, for whatever reason, had chosen to commit a monstrous crime. The jury was faced with a difficult and complex task. They had to weigh the horrific reality of what had happened against the arcane legal definitions of insanity. After hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict that was as complicated as the case itself. They found Ronald DeSantis not guilty of murder by reason of insanity. The gasp that went through the courtroom was one of shock and disbelief. But the verdict was not a complete exoneration. The jury found him guilty but mentally ill on the charges of assaulting Dean and his daughters. This split verdict had a profound impact on his sentence. Because he was not convicted of murder, he could not be sentenced to life in prison. Instead, he was given 2 consecutive 10-year sentences for the assaults, for a total of 20 years. For the Tipton family, the verdict and sentence were a devastating blow, a second brutal assault, this time by the very system they had trusted to deliver justice. Heather Tipton, Logan's mother, gave a heart-wrenching victim impact statement, her voice thick with a grief that would never fade. "He didn't just take my son's life, he destroyed every member of my family," she told the court. "We are all fundamentally different people than we were before December 6th. Dean Tipton echoed her sentiments, his words a raw expression of a father's pain and fury. "You took a human being's life," he said, his gaze fixed on DeSantis. "Regardless of mental illness, your sentence should reflect that. A 6-year-old's life should carry more weight than just a few years in prison." The years that followed were a long and difficult road for the Tiptons. They struggled to heal, to find a new sense of normalcy in a world that had been forever altered. But the specter of Ronald DeSantis, and the injustice they felt, was never far from their minds. Then in October 2025, the wound was ripped open again. News broke that Ronald DeSantis was being released from prison. He had served less than half of his 20-year sentence. The family was blindsided, their grief turning to white-hot rage. How could the man who had murdered their child, who had torn their family apart, be walking free after only 8 years? The explanation lay in a provision of Kentucky law, a statute known as mandatory reentry supervision. This law required the Department of Corrections to release certain inmates after they had served a portion of their sentence, if they had earned enough good time and educational credits. The Kentucky Parole Board had actually reviewed DeSantis' case and issued a decision that he should remain in prison for the remainder of his sentence. But the mandatory supervision law superseded their decision. Their hands were tied. Despite the parole board's recommendation, and despite the heinous nature of his crime, Ronald DeSantis had to be released. The news of his release sparked a firestorm of outrage. The Tipton family, their voices raw with pain and anger, went public with their story. "He told that he was going to kill every one of us. So now I've got to be on extra guard to protect my kids because I will not lose another one," Dean Tipton told a local news station. His anger was palpable, his words a vow of a father's protective fury. In a moment of raw, unguarded honesty, he told the court and the world what he would do if he ever encountered his son's killer. "I've had my talks with God," he said, "and I'm not afraid to tell y'all. I told the court system if I ever cross paths with him, I will kill the man. I'll kill him right where he stands." The story quickly gained national attention. The White House press secretary announced that they were looking into the case, calling it wholly unacceptable for a child killer to walk free after just several years in prison. Upon his release on October 1st, 2025, Exantis requested to serve his mandatory reentry supervision in Florida. He moved to the Sunshine State, settling in a home in Marion County. In a chilling twist that seemed to mock the very idea of public safety, his new residence was located next to an elementary school. But his freedom was short-lived. Florida law requires convicted felons to register with the local sheriff's office within 48 hours of establishing residence. Exantis failed to do so. Alerted to his presence in their community, the Marion County Sheriff's Office acted swiftly. On October 9th, just days after his arrival, Ronald Exantis was arrested for failing to register as a convicted felon and for violating the terms of his parole. He was taken into custody without incident and booked into the Marion County Jail, held without bond. The news of his rearrest brought a small measure of relief to the Tipton family and to the nation that had been captivated by their story. But it did not erase the pain, nor did it fix the systemic failures that had allowed a convicted child killer to be released in the first place. In the wake of this ordeal, the Tipton family has channeled their grief and anger into a new mission. They are now fierce advocates for Logan's Law, a proposed piece of legislation that would require individuals who are found not guilty of violent crimes by reason of insanity to be held in a secure psychiatric facility for the rest of their lives. They are determined that no other family should have to endure the agony and injustice that they have suffered. The story of Ronald Exantis and the Tipton family is a tragedy of immense proportions, a story that lays bare the complexities and shortcomings of the justice system when it is confronted with the intersection of mental illness and extreme violence. It is a story of a family's unimaginable loss, their enduring love for a little boy who was stolen from them, and their courageous fight to ensure that his memory is honored not just with grief, but with meaningful change. It is a stark and painful reminder that the scars of violence run deep, and that for some wounds, there is no healing, only the long and arduous search for a justice that remains for the Tipton family just out of reach. The chill of a Michigan February had settled deep into the soil of Branch County, a landscape of frosted fields and stark, skeletal trees. On Saturday, February 7th, 2009, the air over Girard Township was damp and heavy, the ground a muddy soup from a winter thaw. It was here, on a sprawling property known affectionately as Heath Bar Farm, that the threads of a seemingly ordinary life began to unravel into a tapestry of violence, suspicion, and enduring mystery. The farm, a two-story brick house on Girard Road, was home to the Foley family, Tom, his wife Darlene, and their 10-year-old son Heath. Darlene, known to everyone as Dar, was the heart of this home and a cherished fixture in the nearby community of Union City. At 41, she was a woman whose life was a testament to quiet kindness and unwavering generosity. For 19 years, she had been a beloved elementary school teacher, a gentle guide for countless young minds. Her niece, Amber Rappelia, remembered her aunt as the embodiment of peace, love, and happiness, a person so full of life that her absence would leave a crater in their world. This was a woman who, upon learning her 13-year-old niece needed a kidney transplant, immediately declared, "I'm going to be the one to give you that kidney." Dar was the kind of person you couldn't imagine anyone wanting to harm, which made what happened next all the more incomprehensible. Tom Foley, her husband of nearly 15 years, was a well-known figure in the area, once considered a hometown hero. Their life at Heath Bar Farm, named for their son, appeared idyllic from the outside. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form in the foundation of their marriage. The couple had been experiencing difficulties for about 2 years. They argued frequently, and Tom had confessed to Dar that he no longer loved her. He had even engaged in flirtatious behavior with one of Dar's co-workers, a brief dalliance that he later admitted to his wife. Though they had sought counseling and were attempting to work through their problems, a shadow lingered over their relationship. The day of the murder began with the mundane rhythm of family life. Tom and Dar took Heath to a basketball game in Marshall, followed by a shopping trip in Battle Creek, before returning to their farm. In the afternoon, as the gray light began to fade, Heath was outside playing with a friend, Skylar Waddy. The boys were near the barn when a sudden, loud noise shattered the rural quiet. It sounded, they later said, like thunder or a pane of glass shattering, and it came directly from the house, near the first-floor bathroom. They investigated, but saw nothing amiss. Tom would later offer an explanation for the sound. He claimed he had been moving some old, salvaged windows from the side of the house to the barn. One of the frames, he said, slipped from his grasp, and the glass pane shattered on the back steps. He told the boys everything was fine. A police investigator would later find the windows in the barn and a piece of the broken glass in a flower garden, where Tom said he had placed it while cleaning up. But the prosecution would come to believe that the sharp, explosive sound the boys heard was not breaking glass, but the fatal blast of a shotgun. Shortly before 4 p.m., Tom Foley gathered the two boys. It was Heath's birthday party, and they were heading to a friend's house in Union City to celebrate. Tom dropped the boys off around 4:20 p.m. and then left, saying he needed to get some ice. The homeowner at the party later recalled that Tom seemed nervous and jittery. He was gone for about 15 minutes. Dar was supposed to follow them to the party, bringing 2 other children with her. As the clock ticked past 5 p.m., and with no sign of his wife, Tom began to express concern. He made a series of phone calls, checking with the parents of the other children to see if Dar had arrived to pick them up. She hadn't. Curiously, the one place he didn't call was his own house. Dar didn't own a cell phone, so the landline was the only way to reach her at the farm. The prosecutor would later argue that Tom didn't call home because he already knew no one would answer. His professed anxiety growing, Tom left the party and drove the few miles back to Heath Bar Farm to check on his wife. At 5:20 p.m., a frantic, breathless Tom Foley called 911. He told the dispatcher he had found his wife, that something was terribly wrong. He had found her in the shower, he said, murdered. When law enforcement arrived, they stepped into a scene of controlled chaos. The house appeared to have been burglarized. A window on the back door leading to the kitchen was broken, a glass beer bottle lying shattered nearby as the likely instrument of entry. Parts of the home had been ransacked, drawers were pulled out, and papers were strewn about. Some items were missing: credit cards, financial papers from a desk, and a video game. But investigators noted that expensive electronics, the typical targets of a hurried burglary, were left untouched. The heart of the crime scene was the first-floor bathroom. There, in the shower stall, lay the naked body of Darlene Foley. She had been shot once in the head at close range, the weapon likely a high-powered shotgun fired from about 6 inches away. Tom told police he had turned off the shower when he found her, but a chilling detail was immediately apparent to the first responders. The bathtub and the surrounding area were completely dry. It did not appear as though the shower had been running at all. The investigation, led by Michigan State Police Detective James Carbon, quickly zeroed in on Tom Foley. The staged appearance of the burglary raised immediate red flags. It felt too neat, too selective. To investigators, it looked less like the work of a desperate intruder and more like a clumsy attempt to misdirect them. The theory that began to solidify was a dark one. Tom had killed his wife before he ever left for the party, returned home after dropping off the boys, hastily staged a break-in, and then made the discovery of her body. The circumstantial evidence against him began to mount, piece by damning piece. The troubled state of their marriage provided a potential motive, as did a life insurance policy that would pay out $280,000 upon Dar's death. Then came a crucial piece of information from Dar's own family. Her brother, Brian Weber, told police that a 12-gauge shotgun had been stolen from his gun locker in the summer of 2008, several months before the murder. He hadn't reported it stolen because he assumed a friend or family member had borrowed it. Tom Foley, as his brother-in-law, would have had access to that gun locker. The murder weapon itself was never found, but 2 plastic shotgun shell wads were recovered from the bathroom floor. The most tangible piece of evidence was discovered in the basement of the Foley home, accessible through a door in the very bathroom where Dar was killed. There, detectives found a clean plastic bag containing 3 unused 12-gauge shotgun shells, the same type owned by Dar's brother. The bag stood out, looking pristine compared to the other dusty items in the basement. And on the outside of that bag, investigators found a clear fingerprint, Tom Foley's right index finger. The prosecutor, Terry Norris, would later call this the critical mistake of a man who had never killed before. Forensic analysis of Tom's clothing revealed another small but significant clue. A tiny stain of Dar's blood was found on his shirt. A forensic analyst testified that the stain was not from high-velocity blood spatter, the kind one would expect from a close-range gunshot, but was the result of contact with blood. This meant Tom could have gotten it on his shirt by touching Dar's body or a bloodied surface after she was shot. However, the defense would hammer home a crucial point. There was no gunpowder residue, no blood spatter, no other physical evidence on Tom's clothing or his person to suggest he had fired the fatal shot. If he had shot his wife from 6 inches away, how had he managed to escape without a trace of the violent act on him? His pants were never taken into evidence or tested. Both Heath and his friend Skylar told police that Tom was wearing the same clothes all day, and that they never saw him clean up or change between the time they heard the loud bang and when they left for the party. On March 6, 2009, less than a month after his wife's death, Tom Foley was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and felony firearm possession. His trial began in November of that year, a proceeding that would captivate and divide the small Michigan community. The prosecution, led by Terry Norris, laid out their case with methodical precision. They painted a picture of a failing marriage, a husband who felt trapped and had his eye on another woman. They presented the financial motive of the insurance money and the string of circumstantial clues. The stolen shotgun he had access to, the shells in the basement with his fingerprint, the blood on his shirt, and his strange behavior on the day of the murder, particularly his failure to call home. They argued that the loud noise the boys heard was the gunshot, and that Tom's story about the broken window was a lie fabricated to cover his tracks. Tom's defense attorney, J. Thomas Schaefer, countered aggressively. He argued that the police had suffered from tunnel vision, focusing exclusively on Tom from the very beginning at the expense of other leads. He attacked the lack of direct physical evidence connecting Tom to the shooting. How could a man fire a shotgun at point-blank range and emerge spotless? Schaefer insisted that the burglary was real and that an unknown intruder had killed Dar. He even had a witness, Kenneth Brownell, who testified that sometime between 3 o'clock and 4 p.m. on the day of the murder, he had seen an older model white or light-colored car backing out of the Foley driveway at a high rate of speed. The driver, he said, was a white male with bushy hair. This, the defense argued, was the real killer making his escape. Tom Foley took the stand in his own defense, maintaining his innocence throughout the trial. But the jury of 9 men and 3 women found the prosecution's narrative more compelling. After deliberating for the better part of 2 days, they returned with a verdict on November 27, 2009, guilty on all counts. Tom Foley stood expressionless as the verdict was read, his face a mask of stone. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Dar's family, it was a just conclusion. Her niece Amber spoke for them, stating unequivocally, "We know who did it, and he's still out there," referring to Tom living as a free man after his later acquittal. But for Tom and his supporters, the fight was far from over. And then, after the conviction, came the bombshell. With Tom Foley serving a life sentence, his defense team received a series of unexpected calls. 3 new witnesses came forward, people who had seen something strange at Heath Bar Farm on that fateful February afternoon, but had, for various reasons, remained silent. Their stories would corroborate and expand upon the testimony of the lone trial witness who saw a mysterious car. This newly discovered evidence was enough for the trial court to grant Tom Foley's motion for a new trial, a stunning reversal that gave him a second chance at freedom. At an evidentiary hearing, the new witnesses painted a compelling picture. Terry McCluffin testified that at around 3:30 p.m., he saw a dark SUV-type vehicle parked near a barn on the Foley property, a vehicle he knew didn't belong there and which would not have been visible from the house. Jacqueline Gibson testified that at about 4 p.m., she saw a white, mid-size, 1990s model car parked in the driveway behind Dar's own car. Most dramatically, Jeanette Moore testified that at approximately 4:45 p.m., well after Tom had already left for the party, she was driving past the farm when an older white car came racing out of the driveway, driving forward at such a high speed that she had to slam on her brakes to avoid a collision. She described the driver as a young man, perhaps 18 to 20 years old, with curly black hair and a long face. The appellate court agreed with the trial judge that this new evidence was not merely cumulative. It substantially bolstered the defense's theory of an unknown intruder. The witnesses described different vehicles or the same vehicle at different times and in different positions, suggesting a sustained presence at the farm during the time frame of the murder. The court noted that the case against Tom was entirely circumstantial, and that an acquittal in the first trial would have been just as reasonable as a conviction. Tom Foley's retrial took place in July 2011. This time, the defense came armed with the testimony of the new witnesses. They created a powerful narrative of another person, or perhaps multiple people, present at the farm, and a white car seen fleeing the scene. The prosecution's case, which had seemed so solid, now appeared to have significant holes. The jury at the second trial saw reasonable doubt where the first jury had seen certainty. They came back with a verdict that shocked the prosecution and Dar's family to their core. Not guilty. Tom Foley walked out of prison a free man, cleared of his wife's murder. But freedom did not mean peace. The case was now officially unsolved, a cold file in the cabinets of the Michigan State Police. The police, for their part, made it clear that from their perspective, the investigation was concluded. They had followed the evidence, it had led them to Tom Foley, and they remained confident that he was where the answers lay. Due to the principle of double jeopardy, he could never be tried for Dar's murder again. In the years that followed, the chasm between Tom Foley and Dar's family only widened. Tom, proclaiming his innocence and calling on the police to properly investigate the crime and find his wife's real killer. He pointed to leads he felt were ignored, such as an attempt to use one of the stolen credit cards in Kalamazoo weeks after he was already in jail, a lead the authorities never pursued. Dar's family saw the book as a grotesque exploitation of her death, an arrogant act by a man they still believed was a murderer. Tom Foley has spent years trying to rebuild his life and his relationship with his son, Heath, the boy who lost his mother and nearly lost his father to a life sentence. He maintains that his mission is to get justice for Dar and for his son, who deserves to know the truth. Other theories have swirled in the vacuum left by Tom's acquittal. There was talk of a meth mob and a possibility that Dar, in her role as a teacher and advocate for her students, may have made enemies. She had testified against potentially abusive parents on more than one occasion, even taking out a restraining order against one father. Could this have been a motive for a revenge killing? Police have also named a person of interest, a man named Nicholas Young, though he has not been charged. But for the authorities, the case remains closed. For Dar's family, the killer walks free. For Tom Foley, his name is cleared but his life is forever stained. And in the quiet heart of Michigan, the murder of Darlene Foley at Heath Bar Farm remains a haunting, unresolved tragedy, a story with a beginning and a middle but no end. The question that hangs over the frosted fields is the same one that has haunted Union City for years. If Tom Foley didn't kill his wife, who did? The town of Emstetten, nestled in the most fertile region of Lower Austria, presented a placid face to the world. It was a community of tidy homes, quiet streets, and the mundane rhythms of everyday life. On Ibstrasse, a street like any other, stood a three-story apartment building, painted a pale, unassuming yellow. It was the property of Joseph Fritzl, a retired electrical engineer, known to his tenants and neighbors as a respectable, if somewhat stern and authoritarian, landlord. He lived there with his wife, Rosemary, in an apartment above the ones he rented out. To the outside world, Joseph Fritzl was a man of order, a patriarch who ruled his house like a military dictator, a man whose word was law. But beneath the facade of banal respectability, behind a series of locked doors in the building's cellar, a horror of unimaginable proportions was unfolding, a secret kept for 24 years. The roots of this darkness stretched back decades, into Fritzl's own troubled childhood. Born in Amstetten in 1935, Joseph was raised as an only child by his mother, Maria. His father, a severe alcoholic, had deserted the family when Joseph was just 4, later dying as a soldier in World War II. Maria Fritzl was a working woman, and Joseph would later claim she was relentlessly abusive, both physically and emotionally. He described being beaten until he lay weak and humiliated on the floor, starved of the affection he craved. His mother, he alleged, called him a Satan, a criminal, a no-good. This upbringing forged in him a deep-seated need for control, a pathology that would fester for years. Over time, their roles would chillingly reverse. After Joseph married and bought his house in 1959, his mother moved in with them. He eventually admitted to locking her in the attic, bricking up her window, and keeping her a prisoner until her death in 1980. He had learned the architecture of captivity from the architect of his own misery. In 1956, at 21, Joseph married the 17-year-old Rosemary, and together they had a family of 7 children. He worked various jobs as an electrical engineer and a technical equipment salesman, traveling across Austria. But his respectable life was a lie. In 1967, he was arrested for the rape of a 24-year-old nurse in Linz, whom he had attacked at knife point. He served 12 months of an 18-month sentence. Under Austrian law at the time, this serious conviction was expunged from his record after 15 years, a bureaucratic quirk that would have devastating consequences. When social services later vetted him as a foster parent, his criminal past was invisible. A forensic psychiatrist would later diagnose him with a severe personality disorder, concluding that he was born to rape and had only held himself back for a time. During that first prison sentence, the plan began to germinate. He would one day imprison his own daughter to fully unleash his evil side. His target was Elizabeth, one of his 4 daughters, born in 1966. The abuse began in 1977, when she was just 11 years old. As she grew into a teenager, Elizabeth became rebellious, chafing under her father's tyrannical control. She started a course to become a waitress, dreaming of a life of her own. In 1983, she ran away to Vienna with a friend, a desperate bid for freedom. But the police found her within 3 weeks and returned her to the suffocating confines of the family home. Her attempts to escape only solidified her father's monstrous resolve. He would build a place from which she could never run. Starting in the early 1980s, Fritzl began his project. He applied for a building permit for an extension to his house, a routine request that masked a sinister purpose. While the plan showed a standard basement, he secretly excavated a much larger, deeper space, a hidden world beneath his home. It was a meticulous, calculated construction. The chamber was soundproofed, a tomb of silence. Access was a labyrinth. To reach the final prison, one had to pass through 5 locked basement rooms and a total of 8 doors. The final door was a masterpiece of malevolent engineering, a 1-meter-high, 60-centimeter-wide metal door, reinforced with concrete and set on steel rails. It weighed 300 kilograms and was concealed behind a shelf in his workshop, operated by a secret keyless entry code known only to him. By 1983, he had installed a wash basin, a toilet, a bed, and a hot plate. He had built his kingdom of hell. On August 28, 1984, the trap was set. Elizabeth was 18, had finished her waitress course, and had been offered a job in Linz. Freedom was finally within her grasp. That afternoon, Fritzl asked her for help in the basement, a simple request to assist with carrying a newly constructed door. It was the final piece of his puzzle. As she held the heavy door in place while he fitted it into its frame, he pressed an ether-soaked towel to her face. Her world went black. When she awoke, she was a prisoner. The cover-up was executed with the same chilling precision as the construction of the cell. Rosemary, frantic with worry, filed a missing persons report. Nearly a month later, Fritzl presented the police with a letter from Elizabeth, the first of many he would force her to write. Postmarked from Braunau, it stated that she was tired of her family and had run away to live with a friend, warning them not to look for her or she would leave the country. He supplemented this with a story that she had likely fallen in with a religious cult, a narrative so plausible that it was accepted without question. For Rosemary, her neighbors, and the authorities, Elizabeth Fritzl had simply vanished. The search was called off. Downstairs, a new, horrific reality began for Elizabeth. The hidden chamber, no more than 35 square meters at first, was her entire world. Almost every day, Fritzl would descend to his workshop, telling Rosemary he was drawing up plans for machines he sold to firms. The hiss of the electronic lock, the rumble of the heavy steel door sliding open, would announce his arrival. He brought food and supplies, but his visits were for one primary purpose: to rape her. For the next 24 years, he subjected her to countless assaults. The isolation was absolute, the darkness broken only by the dim glow of a few light bulbs. The air was damp and moldy. This tiny, windowless space was where Elizabeth would become a mother. In 1988, she gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Kirsten. 2 years later, a son, Stefan, was born. Both remained in the cellar with her, children of the dark who would not see the sun or feel fresh air for their entire childhoods. Elizabeth, in the midst of her own torment, became their protector and teacher. With no formal tools, she taught them to read and write, trying to carve out a sliver of normalcy in their subterranean existence. Fritzl's cruelty took on a new, theatrical dimension. He began a second, parallel deception, one that played out in the sunlit world upstairs. In 1992, Elizabeth gave birth to a third child, Lisa. 9 months later, the infant appeared in a cardboard box on the Fritzl's doorstep, accompanied by a note, purportedly from Elizabeth, begging her parents to care for the child. Fritzl played the part of the baffled, benevolent grandfather. He and Rosemary were approved as foster parents. Social services made regular visits, but they saw only a doting couple who had taken in their wayward daughter's abandoned child. They heard nothing, saw nothing to arouse their suspicions. This grotesque charade was repeated. In 1994, Monica was born and left in a pushchair outside the house at 10 months old. This time, Fritzl had Rosemary receive a phone call, using what was likely a recording of Elizabeth's voice, asking her to take the child. Rosemary reported it to the police, expressing her shock that Elizabeth somehow knew their new, unlisted phone number. No one connected the dots. After Monica's birth, Fritzl allowed an expansion of the cellar. He put Elizabeth and her children to work, forcing them to dig out soil with their bare hands for years, enlarging their prison to 55 square meters. In 1996, Elizabeth gave birth to twin boys. One, Alexander, survived. The other, Michael, struggled to breathe from the moment he was born. Elizabeth pleaded with her father to get medical help for the tiny, gasping infant. Fritzl refused. "What is, he said coldly. For more than 60 hours, Elizabeth watched her newborn son die. Fritzl then took the baby's body, carried it upstairs to the furnace, and incinerated it, scattering the ashes in the garden. It was an act of supreme callousness, one for which he would later be charged with murder by negligence. The surviving twin, Alexander, was taken upstairs 15 months later, discovered like his sisters had been. 3 children now lived upstairs with Joseph and Rosemary, attending school, playing with friends, living a life that was a complete fiction. 3 children, Kirsten, Stefan, and a final son, Felix, born in 2002, remained below ground with their mother. For them, the world was a small, musty space. Life was dictated by the whims of their captor. Fritzl provided a television, a radio, and a VCR, but these were instruments of control and humiliation. He would force Elizabeth to watch erotic videos and reenact them in front of her own children. He would punish them by shutting off the electricity, plunging them into total darkness, or by withholding food for days on end. He maintained his control through terror, telling them that if they ever tried to tamper with the door, they would be electrocuted, or that the cellar was rigged to fill with poison gas if they attempted an escape. Empty threats, the police later determined, but terrifyingly real to his captives. A tenant who rented a room on the ground floor for 12 years later recalled hearing strange noises from the basement. Fritzl dismissed them as sounds from the gas heating system or faulty pipes. For 24 years, the house on Ibstrasse held its monstrous secret. But on April 19, 2008, the foundations of Fritzl's dark kingdom began to crack. Kirsten, now 19 years old, fell gravely ill. She was unconscious, her body racked by seizures. Her kidneys were failing. Elizabeth, desperate, begged her father to get help. For days he hesitated, but Kirsten's condition was life-threatening. Fritzl knew he had no choice. He agreed to take her to the hospital. He and Elizabeth carried Kirsten's limp body out of the cellar. For the first time in 8,642 days, Elizabeth saw the outside world, a fleeting, overwhelming glimpse of sky and trees before her father forced her back into the darkness. At the Landesklinicum Amstetten Hospital, Fritzl arrived with the unconscious Kirsten, claiming he had found her on his doorstep with a note from her mother. He presented the note to Dr. Albert Reiter and discussed her condition. But the story was full of holes. The medical staff were puzzled by the young woman's pale, wasted condition and the strange note. They alerted the police on April 21st. The old missing persons case of Elizabeth Fritzl was reopened. The police issued a public appeal for the mother of the mysterious patient to come forward. Fritzl, feeling the pressure, doubled down on his lie, repeating his story about the cult and producing another letter he claimed was from Elizabeth, dated January 2008. Elizabeth, back in the cellar, knew Kirsten's life depended on her. She pleaded with Fritzl to let her go to the hospital, perhaps seeing the inevitable collapse of his world, or perhaps plotting one final, desperate deception where he would rescue his family from the fictitious cult. Fritzl made a fatal error. On the evening of April 26, 2008, he opened the steel door for the last time. He released Elizabeth, now 42, and her sons Stefan, 18, and Felix, 5. He brought them upstairs and presented them to a stunned Rosemary, telling her that Elizabeth had finally decided to come home after her long absence. Later that evening, Joseph and Elizabeth went to the hospital to see Kirsten. A tip-off from Dr. Reiter brought the police to the hospital grounds. They took both father and daughter to the police station for questioning. Elizabeth was terrified, silent. She would not speak as long as her tormentor was near. The investigators made a promise that would change everything. She would never have to see her father again. With that assurance, the dam broke. For the next 2 hours, the full, unvarnished story of her 24-year nightmare poured out. She spoke of the rape, the births, the darkness, the death of her son, the life stolen from her and her children. As she spoke, the quiet town of Amstetten was about to become the center of a global media firestorm. Joseph Fritzl, the 73-year-old patriarch, was arrested. Investigators, guided by a now cooperative Fritzl, found the hidden entrance to the cellar. The world was given its first glimpse into the dungeon. On April 29th, DNA tests confirmed the unthinkable. Joseph Fritzl was the biological father of all 6 of Elizabeth's surviving children. The trial began on March 16, 2009, in the city of St. Polten. Fritzl entered the courtroom hiding his face behind a blue binder. He pleaded guilty to incest, false imprisonment, and rape, but not guilty to murder and slavery. The prosecutor, Christian Berkheiser, painted a horrifying picture for the jury. She had a mark made on the courtroom door at 174 centimeters to show the jury the oppressively low height of the cellar ceiling. She passed around a box of musty, moldy objects from the prison, the smell alone causing jurors to flinch. The centerpiece of the prosecution was Elizabeth's testimony. To spare her the trauma of facing her father, she had recorded 11 hours of videotaped testimony in the months prior. The jurors watched in stunned silence, the harrowing account so disturbing they could only take it in 2-hour segments. On the third day of the trial, there was a stunning development. Elizabeth, wanting to ensure her father faced justice, came to the courthouse. In disguise, she sat in the visitors' gallery as her own videotaped words filled the room. Her lawyer later said that Fritzl looked up and their eyes met. From this point on, you could see Joseph Fritzl going pale and he broke down, his lawyer recounted. The presence of the daughter he had tried to erase from the world shattered his composure. The next day, March 19, 2009, he changed his plea. He stood before the judge and admitted guilt on all charges, including the murder of his infant son Michael through neglect. He was sentenced to life in a high-security psychiatric prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 15 years. "I regret it with all my heart," he mumbled to the court. "I can't make it right anymore." In the aftermath, Elizabeth and her 6 children, the upstairs and downstairs families now united in a shared, complex trauma, were taken to a secure clinic. They were given new identities to shield them from the relentless glare of the media. The adjustment was immense. The downstairs children, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, had to acclimate to sunlight, which pained their eyes, and to open spaces, which triggered anxiety. Stefan, at 5 feet 8 inches, had to learn to walk upright after a lifetime of stooping in the low-ceilinged cellar. Kirsten and Stefan suffered panic attacks at simple things like a closing door or dimming light. The upstairs children had to grapple with the monstrous truth. Their grandfather was their father, and the mother they thought had abandoned them had been a prisoner beneath their feet their entire lives. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to build a new life. They learned to swim, to play outdoors, to be a family. Elizabeth, displaying remarkable resilience, learned to drive and found companionship. The siblings, once separated by a concrete floor, forged normal relationships with one another. The house on Ibstrasse, the House of Horrors, had its cellar filled with concrete in 2013 and was eventually sold. Joseph Fritzl, now Joseph Mehrhoff after changing his name in prison, remains incarcerated, his health failing from advanced dementia. In 2024, courts ruled he could be moved from a psychiatric facility to a regular prison, a decision met with legal challenges, but which could theoretically open a path to his eventual release, though authorities have stated it is not an imminent possibility. The story of the Fritzl case is not just one of unprecedented cruelty and deception. It is also a story of survival. It is the story of Elizabeth, who endured the unimaginable to protect her children, and of those children who stepped out of darkness and into a world they never knew existed, bearing scars that will never fully fade, but with a future that was once impossible. It is a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of absolute evil. The autumn of 2015 settled over the rolling hills of Steuben County, New York, painting the landscape in hues of rust and gold. In the small, rural town of Cadone, life moved to a gentle, predictable rhythm, a world away from the noise and chaos of the city. Here, on a sprawling property, stood a handsome house, a symbol of the American dream, the kind of place where a family could put down roots and watch their children grow. It was the home of Thomas and Kelly Clayton, and to the outside world, their life was as picture-perfect as the autumn scenery that surrounded them. Thomas Clayton, at 37, was a man who still carried the swagger of his former life. A minor league hockey player for the Elmira Jackals, he was a local celebrity, a ruggedly handsome athlete whose name was known and respected in the community. Though his hockey career had wound down, he had transitioned into business, running a fire and water damage restoration company, a venture that provided his family with a comfortable, upper-middle-class life. Kelly Clayton, née Stage, was the heart of their home. At 35, she was a striking woman with a warm, infectious smile. She had been a star athlete herself in high school, a vibrant, popular girl who had met her handsome hockey player husband and settled into the life she had always wanted. She was a devoted mother to their two young children, 7-year-old Charlie and 3-year-old Cullen. Her days a whirlwind of school runs, play dates, and the quiet, often thankless, work of raising a family. She was, by all accounts, a woman deeply in love with her husband and her children, the anchor of their seemingly perfect world. But behind the locked doors of their beautiful home, a different story was unfolding. The idyllic facade was a carefully constructed illusion, a mask that hid a marriage rotting from the inside out. Thomas Clayton was a man of voracious appetites, and his love for his wife had long been eclipsed by his love for other women. His business trips and late nights were a cover for a string of affairs, a secret life of casual encounters and emotional betrayals. He complained about Kelly to his mistresses, painting her as a shrew who would take everything if he divorced her. He craved freedom, but he was unwilling to pay the price of a legal separation. Kelly was not oblivious. She knew, with the painful intuition of a woman betrayed, that her husband was unfaithful. The arguments were becoming more frequent, the silences between them growing longer and colder. The man she had married was a stranger to her, his heart a locked room she could no longer enter. The dream life she had so carefully built was becoming a prison of quiet desperation. In the weeks leading up to that fateful September, the darkness in their home had deepened. Thomas's behavior had become more erratic, his lies more brazen. He had doubled his wife's life insurance policy a year earlier, a move that, in retrospect, looked like a chilling act of premeditation. He was a man planning an exit, not just from his marriage, but from his wife. The night of Tuesday, September 29th, 2015, began like any other. Kelly put the children to bed, the familiar rituals of stories and lullabies a comforting rhythm in a house that had lost its harmony. Thomas, meanwhile, was constructing his alibi. He had a poker game with friends, a perfectly ordinary Tuesday night activity. He was seen, he was accounted for, his presence a verifiable fact. But while he was playing cards and drinking with his friends, a different kind of game was being played, a deadly game he had set in motion weeks earlier. The other player was a man named Michael Beard. Beard was an employee at Thomas's company, a man who had recently fallen on hard times. He had been fired from his job and was desperate for money. He was a man in a vulnerable position, a man who could be bought. The arrangement, as prosecutors would later piece it together, was simple and brutal. Thomas Clayton had offered Michael Beard $10,000 in cash to do the unthinkable, to kill his wife and burn down the house, a final, fiery erasure of a life he no longer wanted. The plan was meticulous. Thomas had swapped vehicles with a friend, giving Beard access to a red Ram truck that could not be traced back to him. He had left a key to the house in the garage. He had made calls to a neighboring storage facility, inquiring about the reach of their surveillance cameras, making sure the parking lot of his business, where he and Beard would meet, was a blind spot. Around 11 p.m. that night, Beard's wife saw him leave their home on a bicycle. He met up with a friend, Mark Blandford, who agreed to act as his lookout, apparently unaware of the true, bloody nature of the night's work. On the way to the Clayton home, Beard turned to his friend and uttered a phrase that, "I'm going to have to kill a bitch." Shortly before he left the poker game, Thomas made a call. He borrowed a phone from another woman at the party, a seemingly casual act, and called Michael Beard. It was the signal, the green light, the final move in a deadly game of chess. Just after midnight, in the early hours of Wednesday, September 30th, Thomas Clayton arrived home. He pulled into the driveway of the dark, silent house. He walked inside, and then, a few moments later, the night was shattered by the sound of his frantic voice on a 911 call. "My wife is dead," he screamed at the dispatcher, his voice a performance of shock and grief. "She's on the floor. There's blood everywhere." The first two officers to arrive, Deputies Dean Swan and Don Lewis of the Steuben County Sheriff's Office, stepped into a scene of unimaginable horror. Swan's body camera was rolling, its unblinking eye capturing a tableau of savage brutality. The house was in disarray, a clear sign of a violent struggle. Blood was smeared on the walls, a trail of terror that led from the upstairs hallway, down the stairs, and into the kitchen. And there, on the floor, lay the body of Kelly Clayton. She had been bludgeoned to death. Her life ended with a ferocious violence that spoke of a deep and personal rage. The weapon, investigators would later determine, was a fiberglass maul handle, an object of brute force that had been used to shatter a life. Thomas Clayton, the grieving husband, now the prime suspect. His alibi was solid, witnesses, GPS data placing him at the poker game, but the circumstances were too suspicious to ignore. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a robbery. It was a crime of rage, and the rage, investigators believed, had come from within the house. But the most damning piece of evidence came from the smallest, most innocent of witnesses. In the chaos of that night, as police officers moved through the blood-spattered house, they found the two children, huddled in their beds, terrified but physically unharmed. An investigator sat down with 7-year-old Charlie, her small face a mask of confusion and fear. She had been woken by the noise, she said. She had seen the man who had hurt her mommy. And when the investigator asked her what the man looked like, she gave an answer that sent a chill down the spine of every officer who heard it. "He looked like my dad," she said. For the investigators, it was a bombshell. The focus of the investigation narrowed with laser-like precision on Thomas Clayton. The alibi, they reasoned, must be a trick, a clever piece of misdirection. But as they dug deeper, another name surfaced, Michael Beard. The phone records told a story of a constant, almost obsessive, line of communication between Thomas and his former employee. A flurry of calls and texts in the days and hours leading up to the murder, including the one from the poker game. On October 3rd, just days after the murder, Michael Beard was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. It didn't take long for him to break. In an interview with investigators, he confessed. He laid out the entire sordid plot. The $10,000, the plan to kill Kelly and burn down the house, the key left in the garage, the swapped truck. The confession was a Rosetta Stone, translating a seemingly senseless act of violence into a cold, calculated murder for hire. The case was no longer about a husband who had snapped. It was about a husband who had hired a hitman. The charges against both men were upgraded to first-degree murder. Beard led the police to the evidence he had tried to dispose of. He showed them where he had thrown the maul handle, the murder weapon, into a small creek. He led them to the bloody clothes he had worn that night. The case against him was ironclad, but the case against Thomas Clayton, the architect of the crime, was more complex. Beard, in a move that would complicate the prosecution, recanted his confession. He now claimed that Thomas had hired him only to burn down the house for the insurance money, not to kill his wife. He said that when he entered the house, he found Kelly already dead, and he had panicked and fled. This new story, while self-serving, meant that prosecutors could not use his initial confession against Thomas, nor could they call him to testify. The two men would have to be tried separately. Michael Beard's trial went first. Despite his new story, the evidence was overwhelming. His DNA was on the murder weapon. His lookout, Mark Blandford, testified about the chilling words he had spoken on the way to the crime scene. In November 2016, a jury found Michael Beard guilty of first and second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial of Thomas Clayton began in January 2017. With Beard's testimony off the table, the prosecution, led by Chemung County District Attorney Whedon Wetmore, had to build their case on a mountain of circumstantial evidence. But what a mountain it was! They presented the jury with a portrait of a man desperate to escape his marriage, a man who had told his mistresses that a divorce would ruin him financially. They presented the evidence of his meticulous planning, the calls about the surveillance cameras, the swapped truck, the key. And they had a secret weapon, a piece of digital forensics that would become the crux of their case. An analyst named Cy Ray, a specialist in cell phone location data, had created a detailed, visual timeline of the night of the murder. Using the pings from Thomas's and Beard's cell phones, he was able to show the jury a chilling dance of two men moving in concert, a digital echo of a murderous pact. The data showed them meeting in the blind spot of the surveillance cameras. It showed Beard's movements to and from the Clayton home, and it showed the constant communication that bound them together. It was a 21st century ghost story, a tale told by the invisible signals that trail behind us all. The defense argued that the case was pure speculation, a collection of unrelated facts cobbled together to fit a preconceived theory. But for the jury, the circumstantial evidence, in its totality, was a rope that was tightening around Thomas Clayton's neck. The most powerful voice in the courtroom, however, was one that was not physically present. At Thomas's sentencing, after a jury had found him guilty of first and second-degree murder, Kelly's sister, Kim Bourgeois, read a statement. It was a letter that had been written by 7-year-old Charlie, the little girl who had seen a monster in her home. She loved her mom. She loved her dad, Kim read, her voice choked with emotion, but that her dad was a coward because he made Michael Beard kill Mommy. In that moment, the initial, confusing statement of a terrified child became clear. When she said the intruder looked like Daddy, it wasn't because she had seen his face. The man had been wearing a mask. It was his build, his clothes, the familiar shape of a man in the dark, that had triggered the association in her young mind. She hadn't seen her father, but she had seen the man he had sent to do his bidding. Thomas Clayton was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the same fate as the man he had hired. He maintains his innocence to this day, a man who thought he had crafted the perfect alibi, a man who believed he could outsmart the world. But he had underestimated the power of a few stray cell phone pings, and he had fatally underestimated the memory of a 7-year-old girl. The story of Thomas Clayton is a story of a man who had everything, a beautiful wife, healthy children, a comfortable life, and threw it all away for the selfish pursuit of his own desires. It is a story of a love that curdled into a resentment so profound that it could only be satisfied by death. It is a story of a town rocked by a crime of unimaginable brutality and of a family shattered beyond repair. And at its heart, it is the story of a little girl who, in the darkest moment of her young life, spoke a truth that was more powerful than any lie her father could ever tell. The two children, now being raised by the aunt who loves them as her own, are the living legacy of a tragedy that should never have happened, the innocent survivors of a storm that their own father unleashed upon their home. The cold January air of East Pennsboro Township, Pennsylvania, held a deceptive stillness. It was a place of manicured lawns and the quiet hum of suburban life, a community built on the promise of safety and a sense of belonging. For Randy and Brian Trimble, who had married in the hopeful autumn of 2000, it was the perfect canvas upon which to paint their future. To the outside world, they were an idyllic couple. Randy, a vibrant and dedicated 28-year-old speech pathologist, was the sun around which their small universe revolved. She was devoted, loving, and possessed a protective nature that extended to all corners of her life. Brian was her counterpoint, quiet, introverted, and intelligent, a man who seemed content to exist in the warm glow of his wife's affection. They lived in a pleasant home, a tangible symbol of their shared dreams and the family they planned to one day start. But beneath the placid surface of their life, a current of darkness was gathering strength, an undercurrent of resentment and macabre fantasy that would soon breach the surface and shatter the tranquility of their world forever. Brian worked as a computer technician for an insurance company in nearby Harrisburg, a job that suited his methodical and reserved personality. It was there he found a kindred spirit in his colleague, Blaine Norris. Norris was a man consumed by a singular passion, horror movies. He didn't just watch them, he aspired to create them. He was a self-proclaimed horror geek, dreaming of making a name for himself as a director, of translating the gruesome fantasies in his head onto the silver screen. His ambition was a low-budget horror flick, a gritty, terrifying story set against the rugged backdrop of the Appalachian Trail. Brian, himself a horror fanatic, was drawn to Norris's vision. The project offered an escape from the quiet predictability of his life, a chance to delve into a world of manufactured fear and suspense. He signed on to be the film's cinematographer, a role that allowed him to participate from behind the scenes, observing and capturing the unfolding horror without being at its center. For a time, the film was a thrilling secret shared between the two friends, a world of make-believe violence and staged terror. However, the dream began to fray at the edges. Norris's project was plagued with problems. The film's primary investor, spooked by the amateur nature of the production, pulled his funding. Then, the cameraman was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, rendering him unable to handle the physical demands of shooting on the hiking trails. Undeterred, Norris pushed forward, pouring his own money into the production, racking up enormous credit card debt in a desperate attempt to keep his flickering dream alive. The movie, once a source of creative excitement, was becoming a financial millstone around his neck. It was during this period of mounting desperation for Norris that a new tension entered the Trimble household. Randy, ever practical and protective, saw Norris's film as a foolish and wasteful endeavor. She reportedly disapproved of Brian's involvement, dismissing it as a stupid movie and urging him to pull out. Whether it was out of concern for their finances or a simple distaste for the grim subject matter, her opposition was firm. Brian, ever the quiet and seemingly compliant husband, acquiesced. He withdrew from the project, leaving a frustrated Norris to complete the film on his own. On the surface, it was a minor marital disagreement, a small course correction in the flow of their life together. But for Brian, something had shifted. His wife's control over his hobbies, and more pointedly, over their finances, began to chafe. He saw her as the regulator of his life, the one who held the purse strings and dictated the terms of his engagement with the world. A quiet, insidious resentment began to fester in the dark corners of his mind, intertwining with the violent imagery of the horror films he so admired. He started confiding in friends that he and Randy were having marital difficulties, a subtle crack in the facade of their perfect union. The solution to his problems, as Brian began to see it, was a plot twist worthy of the darkest horror film. It was a thought that took root and grew, nurtured by greed and a chilling detachment from morality. Randy had a life insurance policy worth $100,000. Her death would not only free him from what he perceived as her control, but would also deliver a significant financial windfall. It was a thought so monstrous it required a collaborator, someone who shared his affinity for the macabre and, more importantly, was desperate enough to act. He knew just the person. Brian approached Blaine Norris, the friend whose own dreams were crumbling under the weight of debt. He laid out a deadly proposition, a real-life horror script where the lines between fantasy and reality would be irrevocably blurred. He would hire Norris to kill Randy. In exchange for the act, Norris would receive $20,000 of the insurance money, a sum that would solve his immediate financial crisis. For Norris, a man already steeped in fictional violence and facing real-world ruin, the offer was a lifeline he was willing to grasp, no matter how bloody. The two friends, bound by a shared obsession and a shocking lack of conscience, struck a deal. They became conspirators in a plot to commit murder. The plan was meticulously, chillingly crafted. They researched their roles as if preparing for a film production. A week before the murder, Brian sent Norris a link to a website that provided step-by-step instructions on how to commit murder, a digital guide to a perfect crime. Norris, in turn, studied technical books on forensics, learning how to erase his presence from a crime scene, how to become a ghost. Brian's role was to be the grieving husband, his alibi the unshakable pillar of his innocence. He would go out to dinner with friends, a public performance of normalcy, while Norris carried out the grim reality of their pact. They even planned to stage the scene as a robbery gone wrong, hoping to throw investigators off the scent by creating a narrative of random, tragic violence. Brian planned to remove jewelry and cash from the home to bolster the illusion, hoping to file an additional insurance claim for the stolen items. The night of January 10th, 2003, arrived cold and clear. As Randy finished her day's work, unaware of the horror that awaited her, Brian set the final pieces of their plan in motion. He went out for dinner, his every action a carefully rehearsed line in a script of deception. While he laughed and talked with friends, Blaine Norris slipped into the shadows of the Trimble home, entering the garage to lie in wait for his victim. When Randy returned home that night, she pulled her car into the garage, the familiar rumble of the engine the last ordinary sound she would ever hear. As she stepped out of the car, Norris emerged from the darkness. The attack was brutal and swift, a frenzy of violence that mirrored the gruesome scenes from the horror movies they both loved. He strangled her with an extension cord and stabbed her repeatedly, more than 20 times, as she reportedly prayed for her life. The loving wife, the devoted daughter, the compassionate speech pathologist, lay dead on the cold concrete floor of her own garage, her life extinguished in a storm of calculated rage. A short time later, Brian returned home to his silent house. His alibi was now cemented. He walked into the garage and discovered the horrific scene. His call to 911 was filled with the manufactured panic of a husband who has just stumbled upon an unthinkable tragedy. When the first responders arrived, they found a scene of carnage. Randy's body was almost unrecognizable. The house had been ransacked, furniture overturned in a chaotic display meant to suggest a violent struggle with an intruder. But to the trained eyes of the investigators, something felt wrong. Nothing of significant value appeared to be missing. The scene felt staged, too perfect in its imperfection. From the very beginning, suspicion fell on Brian Trimble. Despite his solid alibi and his performance of a devastated husband, his behavior struck detectives as off. His stories were inconsistent, his grief seemed hollow. He was a horror fanatic whose wife had just been murdered in a manner befitting a slasher film, a coincidence that was too glaring to ignore. Investigators began to tail him, their presence a constant, unnerving pressure. They monitored his every move, listened to his conversations, and waited for the carefully constructed facade to crack. For months, the investigation seemed to stall. There was no forensic evidence linking Brian to the crime. Norris's research had paid off. There were no witnesses. There was only the gnawing suspicion in the detectives' minds and the mounting, unspoken tension that surrounded Brian Trimble. He was a man living under a microscope, the stress of his terrible secret eating away at him day by day. He frantically tried to collect on Randy's life insurance policy, an eagerness that only deepened the police's suspicions. He needed the money to pay his hitman, a debt that was likely becoming a source of pressure from the increasingly restless Norris. Finally, on May 8, 2003, nearly 4 months after the murder, Brian Trimble broke. Under the weight of relentless interrogation and his own guilt, the quiet, introverted man confessed. He admitted everything: the resentment, the financial motive, the pact with his friend. He told them how he had hired Blaine Norris to kill his wife for her life insurance money. With Brian's confession, the final act of the tragedy began. He was arrested on May 9, 2003, and charged with criminal homicide, conspiracy, and insurance fraud. A few months later, Blaine Norris was also taken into custody. Faced with the DA's intention to seek the death penalty and the irrefutable evidence of his friend's confession, Norris abandoned his claims of innocence. Just before his trial was set to begin, he accepted a plea deal. Both Brian Trimble and Blaine Norris pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, trading a potential death sentence for life in prison without the possibility of parole. The two friends, whose shared fantasy of horror led to real-life atrocity, were sent to separate state correctional institutions to live out their days behind bars. Brian Trimble, the husband who orchestrated his wife's murder, is incarcerated at SCI Benner Township. Blaine Norris, the aspiring filmmaker who became a killer for hire, is imprisoned at SCI Somerset. Detectives believe that had Norris not been caught, his taste for violence might not have been sated. He likely would have killed again. In the devastating wake of Randy's murder, her mother, Nancy Chavez, chose to create a legacy of hope from the ashes of her grief. She founded Randy's Race, an event to raise money and awareness for domestic violence victims, and established Randy's House of Angels, a sanctuary for abused children to find safety and healing. Through these acts of profound grace, a story that began with darkness and deception found a measure of light, transforming the senseless horror of Randy Trimble's death into a force for good in the world. The quiet suburban street in East Pennsboro Township is calm once more, but the story of what happened in that garage serves as a chilling reminder that evil can lurk anywhere, even behind the most ordinary of doors and the most familiar of faces. The Friday night shift at the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt shop in Northwest Austin was winding down as the clock approached 11 on December 6, 1991. The small storefront sat in a strip mall along Anderson Lane, a busy commercial corridor where families shopped and teenagers hung out on weekend evenings. Inside, 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison and 17-year-old Eliza Thomas, both employees of the shop, were preparing to close for the night. They had been working together for hours, serving frozen yogurt to the steady stream of customers that always seemed to pick up on Friday nights. Waiting patiently for them to finish were Jennifer's 15-year-old sister, Sarah Harbison, and Sarah's friend, 13-year-old Amy Ayers. The two younger girls had arrived at the shop earlier that evening, planning to catch a ride home with Jennifer when her shift ended at 11. It was a typical arrangement for teenage sisters, the kind of mundane detail that families would later remember with heartbreaking clarity. Sarah and Amy sat in the shop, probably chatting about school or their weekend plans, watching Jennifer and Eliza clean and prepare to lock up. None of them could have imagined that these would be the final hours of their lives. None of them knew that someone was watching, waiting, planning something unspeakable. Shortly before midnight, an Austin Police Department patrol officer noticed smoke coming from the yogurt shop and radioed his dispatcher. As fire crews rushed to the scene and began battling the flames, they had no idea what horror awaited them inside. When firefighters finally extinguished the blaze and entered the building, they made a discovery that would haunt Austin for decades to come. For bodies lay inside the smoke-damaged shop. All four victims were teenage girls, all unclothed, and all had been shot in the head. Three of them, Sarah, Eliza, and Jennifer, had been bound and gagged with their own underwear. The level of violence was staggering. Each girl had been shot execution-style with a .22 caliber bullet. Amy had also been shot with a .380 caliber pistol. Three of the bodies were severely charred from the fire that had been deliberately set to destroy evidence. There was evidence of sexual assault. The crime scene told a horrifying story. The killer or killers had either entered the shop just before closing or had remained hidden until the store was empty of other customers. They had forced the four girls to undress, bound three of them with their own clothing, and subjected them to unspeakable violence before shooting each one in the head. Then, in a calculated attempt to eliminate evidence, they had set fire to the building. The murders stunned Austin, a city that prided itself on being a safe, progressive college town. This was 1991, and mass shootings and brutal crimes against children were not yet the regular occurrences they would become in later decades. The yogurt shop murders, as they quickly became known, represented a level of depravity that the community had never experienced. For innocent girls, ranging in age from 13 to 17, had been tortured, violated, and murdered in a place that should have been safe, in a neighborhood filled with families and young people. Jennifer and Sarah's mother, Barbara Harbison, would spend the next 3 decades wondering who had killed her daughters and why. Eliza's family and Amy's family joined her in a grief so profound that it seemed impossible to process. These were not just victims, they were daughters, sisters, friends, students with their whole lives ahead of them. Jennifer and Eliza had been responsible employees, trusted to close the shop alone. Sarah and Amy were young girls excited about a Friday night, looking forward to the weekend. In an instant, all of their futures had been erased. The investigation began immediately, with Austin police throwing enormous resources at the case. Detectives canvassed the area, interviewed potential witnesses, and collected what physical evidence they could from the fire-damaged scene. But the deliberate arson had destroyed much of the forensic evidence that might have quickly identified the perpetrator. The case that would become known as one of Austin's most devastating and haunting mysteries had begun. For 8 long years, the yogurt shop murders remained unsolved. Investigators pursued hundreds of leads, interviewed countless suspects, and worked tirelessly to bring justice to the 4 murdered girls. The case consumed the Austin Police Department and haunted the city. Memorials were held, rewards were offered, but no arrests were made, and the families of the victims lived in a terrible limbo, unable to find closure or answers. Then, in 1999, the case took a dramatic turn. 8 years after the murders, police arrested 4 young men: Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. All 4 had been teenagers at the time of the murders. 2 of them, Scott and Springsteen, confessed to the crimes after lengthy interrogations. To the families and the community, it seemed like justice had finally arrived. After 8 years of waiting and wondering, authorities had found the killers. But the relief would prove premature, and the confessions would open a dark chapter in the history of wrongful convictions. The interrogations that produced the confessions were aggressive and coercive. Police officers yelled and swore at the young suspects during hours-long questioning sessions. According to later reports, one officer even held a gun to a suspect's head. The confessions themselves contained details about the murders, but they were also riddled with inconsistencies and inaccuracies that should have raised red flags. For example, Michael Scott claimed in his confession that the killers had entered the yogurt shop office during the crime. But when police arrived at the scene, that door had been locked from the inside, requiring a key to open. It was physically impossible for the events to have happened as Scott described them. Similar discrepancies appeared throughout both confessions, details that didn't match the physical evidence or the crime scene. Despite these problems, prosecutors Ron Lara, Darla Davis, and Buddy Jones moved forward with the cases. They believed they had 6 written confessions, though they also knew they needed solid evidence to back up the statements. Charges were eventually dropped against Pierce and Wellborn, who had never confessed. But Scott and Springsteen, the 2 who had confessed, went to trial. Both men were convicted of capital murder in separate trials. Robert Springsteen was sentenced to death. Michael Scott received a life sentence. It appeared that justice had been served, that the 4 girls could finally rest in peace, and that their families could begin to heal. But the story was far from over. Both convictions were appealed, and both were eventually overturned due to constitutional errors in the trials. As the cases were being prepared for retrial, advances in DNA technology provided a shocking revelation. DNA evidence found on the body of one of the victims did not match any of the 4 arrested men. The genetic material pointed to someone else entirely. In 2009, prosecutors made the difficult decision to free both Springsteen and Scott. One man had been sent to death row, and another had served years in prison for murders they almost certainly did not commit. The yogurt shop case was back to square one, unsolved and seemingly unsolvable. The families were devastated once again, forced to accept that the justice they thought they had received had been illusory. The Travis County District Attorney would later acknowledge the terrible mistake. The overwhelming weight of the evidence points to the guilt of 1 man and the innocence of 4, a representative from the office stated, referring to the wrongfully convicted men. If the conclusions of that investigation are confirmed, the Travis County District Attorney's Office will take responsibility for our role in prosecuting these men, in sending 1 to death row and 1 to serve life in prison. For 16 more years, the case remained cold. The DNA evidence sat in storage, waiting for technology to advance enough to identify its source. Investigators never gave up, but leads dried up and the trail went cold. The families marked anniversaries and birthdays, always wondering if they would ever know the truth about what happened on that terrible December night in 1991. Then in 2025, 33 years after the murders, came the breakthrough that everyone had been waiting for. Advances in DNA analysis and forensic genealogy, combined with a renewed examination of ballistics evidence, led investigators to a name: Robert Eugene Brashers. Brashers was not an unknown figure to law enforcement. Born on March 13, 1958, he had compiled a lengthy criminal record that included attempted murder, burglary, and impersonating a police officer. But more significantly, DNA evidence had linked him to a string of violent crimes across multiple states, making him a serial rapist and serial killer of extraordinary brutality. The investigation revealed a pattern of violence that spanned nearly a decade. In 1990, Brashers had been linked to the rape and murder of Genevieve Zatricki, a 28-year-old woman found beaten and strangled in her bathtub in Greenville, South Carolina. In March 1997, he had raped a 14-year-old girl in Memphis, Tennessee, after forcing his way into a home with a revolver and tying up the occupants. And in 1998, he had murdered Sherry Scherer, 38, and her 12-year-old daughter Megan in Portageville, Missouri, sexually assaulting the child before killing them both. The timeline was chilling. The yogurt shop murders had occurred in December 1991, fitting perfectly into Brasher's pattern of escalating violence. His method of operation matched the crime. He often used firearms, bound his victims, and in at least one case had held multiple victims captive simultaneously. The DNA evidence found on one of the yogurt shop victims matched Brasher's genetic profile. On Monday, September 29, 2025, Austin police held a press conference to announce their findings. Lead Detective Daniel Jackson outlined the investigation and explained how cutting-edge DNA analysis had finally cracked the case. The families of the victims were present, their faces showing a mixture of relief, grief, and exhaustion. Barbara Harbison, who had lost both of her daughters that night in 1991, spoke about the decades-long wait for answers. "It has been such a long time, and all we ever sought was the truth regarding this case," she said, her voice filled with emotion. The other families echoed her sentiments, grateful that the mystery had finally been solved but forever scarred by the loss they had endured. There was, however, a frustrating postscript to the announcement. Robert Eugene Brashers would never face trial for the yogurt shop murders. He had died in 1999, just 8 years after the crimes, during a standoff with law enforcement in Missouri. On January 19, 1999, police had confronted Brashers, and rather than surrender, he had shot himself. He was 40 years old at the time of his death. The timing was darkly ironic. Brashers had killed himself in the same year that 4 innocent men were being arrested and interrogated for his crimes. While Scott and Springsteen were being subjected to coercive questioning and false confessions were being extracted, the real killer was taking his own life, carrying his secrets to the grave. While Pierce and Wellborn were being held under suspicion, Brashers was escaping justice forever. At the September 2025 press conference, Detective Jackson emphasized that the investigation remained ongoing. While the overwhelming evidence pointed to Brashers as the perpetrator, investigators were still following leads and examining whether anyone else had been involved. Jackson also noted that Brashers could potentially be linked to other unsolved killings, suggesting that the full extent of his crimes might never be known. The case also raised troubling questions about the criminal justice system and the reliability of confession evidence. The false confessions that had sent 2 innocent men to prison, one to death row, were the result of aggressive interrogation tactics that are now widely recognized as likely to produce unreliable statements. The yogurt shop case became part of a broader pattern of wrongful convictions linked to coerced confessions, joining a long list of cases where innocent people had been imprisoned for crimes they did not commit. The investigators who worked the case in 1999 had been under tremendous pressure to solve one of Austin's most notorious crimes. They had genuinely believed they had the right suspects, and they had worked to build cases against them. But in their determination to bring closure to the families, they had made catastrophic errors. The confessions they obtained were not backed up by physical evidence, and the discrepancies should have been recognized as red flags. Instead, 4 young men had their lives derailed, and the real killer remained free to continue his reign of terror. For the families of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy, the 2025 announcement brought a bittersweet form of closure. After 33 years of waiting, wondering, and hoping, they finally knew who had killed their daughters and why. Robert Eugene Brasher's had been a serial predator, a man who targeted vulnerable victims and showed no mercy. The girls had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, crossing paths with a monster who saw them as nothing more than prey. The yogurt shop murders remain one of the most devastating crimes in Austin's history. For young lives were stolen in an act of senseless violence that scarred a community and haunted investigators for more than 3 decades. The case exposed flaws in the criminal justice system and resulted in wrongful convictions that sent innocent men to prison. It took advances in forensic science and the tireless work of cold case detectives to finally identify the killer, long after he had escaped earthly justice. Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers deserved to grow up, to graduate from school, to fall in love, to have families of their own. Instead, they became names on a memorial, victims of one of Texas's most notorious unsolved crimes. The identification of Robert Eugene Brasher's as their killer has finally given their families the truth they sought for so long, even if it cannot give them back what was taken that December night in 1991. The investigation continues, with authorities still working to determine if Brasher's had accomplices and whether he was responsible for other unsolved crimes. But for Austin, for the families, and for everyone who followed this case over the decades, the question that haunted them for 33 years has finally been answered. The man who murdered 4 innocent girls in a yogurt shop on a December night in 1991 was Robert Eugene Brasher's, a serial killer whose reign of terror ended with his suicide in 1999, leaving behind a trail of devastation that law enforcement is still working to fully document. The yogurt shop murders will never be forgotten in Austin. The case serves as a reminder of the fragility of life, the importance of justice, and the absolute necessity of getting investigations right the first time. 4 girls died that night. 4 innocent men were wrongly convicted, and 1 serial killer escaped accountability for his crimes by taking his own life. The tragedy is compounded by layers of injustice and loss that extend far beyond that burning yogurt shop 33 years ago. But at least now, finally, the families know the truth. And perhaps, in that truth, they can find some measure of peace.